one piece I want to push you on is you said that you want to get government out of corporate America. There are parts of it I agree with, but to me, that seems like the total opposite direction to go in. And, I'm not for regulation's sake, but I think with this whole submersible down to the Titanic situation, you had a pretty clear example of where you could have really used some additional regulation requiring the submersible to meet basic standards of safety, and you very well would not have lost the lives on board. And this doesn't seem like a problem that, like, the free market would just fix with perfect information. Granted, now I think there are going to be a lot fewer people going on submersibles down to the Titanic, but at a grave cost to those people's lives and their families.
I would disagree with that. At a fundamental level, as well as at a practical level, I don't believe it's an example where regulation would help. Uh, what the experts have said is as stupid does. I believe that that is true. There were plenty of people who knew that there were problems with that submersible, and I don't want to get into technical details because a lot has yet to be revealed about the situation. But I frankly don't see a reason why you would not believe that greater information would not come out and that markets would not correct this situation. I think that it's very likely that we will be
But
going in
it's
the right
Well,
my
direction.
people
point is
had to
this.
die to
Mm,
give us that information,
right.
right? Like
It's a quite high cost.
the submersible community was being badgered by experts in the industry who were basically saying, "Look, you're not up to our standards, and there's going to be a disaster here." And in fact, the CEO fired somebody who he hired, brought on for safety reasons. The guy released a report and was like, "Listen, man, this thing is not safe to go below 1,000 meters." And of course, the Titanic's 4,000 meters down, and he fired the person on the spot as soon as he released the report. So, isn't this an instance? I get it that libertarians are skeptical of. Regulation from the government on industry, but don't like the specifics matter? Aren't there some regulations which are just obviously rational and then others that are not? And the ones that are not good we can get rid of, but the ones that we need, it makes sense to keep.
Or you're conflating the word regulation with government. I think that that may be where you and I part ways. Yes, an outside force, an outside view, an outside source of information, a third party, whether that comes from an insurance company or outside experts, can be enormously influential and enormously helpful. We have plenty of examples down through the generations of organizations that get together either pooled in an industry or through their requirements to have insurance involved and have flaws brought to light, problems brought to light that don't require the government to do so. This is an enormous tragedy. There's no question about that. I don't think there's a counter argument to how disappointed we are and how badly we feel for the individuals who lost their lives and the enormous tragedy that it represents for the families, as well as, less importantly, perhaps, the people that believed in this project and the people that wanted there to be further exploration in this area to go forward. So there's plenty of disappointment to go around. I hope that no one thinks that we're trying to, either you or I are trying to mount some sort of an argument that says, you know, too bad, so sad, this doesn't matter. That's not at all where I think that this conversation should be going. The issue really is, should people be allowed to make decisions for themselves? And should the government have not only the authority to say, here's what's going on, here's the information you need, but to shut down by force, to shut down individuals' rights to pursue something that is enormously risky? This is not, making sure that something you plug into the wall every day works well, right? This is a very unusual circumstance. Of all the things that we regulate in the world, I'm not sure why we're picking this
Well,
That's because
because a
particular
bunch of people
example.
just died. That's
it's a
why.
clear
It's a
example.
clear example. Like, here, let me ask you this. I'll give you another example. Like, what is authoritarian versus what is just a basic regulation? So, like, seatbelts, for example, are they authoritarian, or is it just a basic regulation where people should be required by law to wear their seatbelt?
Oh, well, it's definitionally authoritarian. What you and I are talking about is whether or not that's a good idea. I don't think there's a counter argument that says it's not authoritarian. What we're saying is the government has assumed to itself the authority to make decisions for you, whether you think they're good or bad. I personally think it's a good idea to wear a seatbelt, but there are other people who don't, I suppose. But the government assumes to itself the authority to make that decision for you. So it's definitionally authoritarian. What we're just discussing is whether we should be ceding some of our civil liberties to the government in order to make the world safer. Would you agree that that's an accurate characterization of what we're discussing?
So I would not use the term authoritarian for seatbelts. I would just say it's a basic regulation. I'll give you another example. There was just a big
Well,
earthquake
what would you
in
consider
Turkey.
authoritarian? Help me
Well,
with a
so
counter example. What's the
so the
difference
distinction
between a
I'm trying to
regulatory
draw
structure and authoritarianism?
the distinction I'm trying to draw is that this isn't just like authoritarian or libertarian. It's not like freedom versus anti-freedom. There's this massive area in the middle, which is a gray area, and there's a spectrum. And so whatever minor trade-off there is to wear seatbelts, I think is basically worth it, which is why I wouldn't categorize it as authoritarian. I'll give you another example. There was a giant
So
earthquake in
you're
Turkey
saying that
recently.
authoritarian is defined by whether or not you think it's a good idea.
Well, I mean, I think that's the debate everybody has all day long when it comes to government. So, of course. So let me give you
Well,
another example. I want to hear your
agreed,
response
but
to
that's
this.
not the definition of
I want to hear your response to
authoritarianism.
this. There was a big earthquake in Turkey not too long ago, and what we found, a bunch of buildings collapsed, and they weren't supposed to collapse. And what we found out is basically there was corruption going on where Turkish officials were getting paid off, and they were then allowing these builders to flout basic building safety regulations. So effectively, a large percentage of the buildings in Turkey did not have safety regulations associated with them. Would you say that having those building regulations is authoritarian?
I would say the government shoving down your throat certain rules is authoritarian, but I think you and I should agree that that's the definition of authoritarian. I don't want to get into a semantics debate with you. The issue is whether this should be handled at a government level or whether it should be handled at an industrial level. You mentioned that this was the result of corruption. No one should be in the corner of corruption. No one is arguing that corruption is not a bad thing, right? Whether this was handled at the government or this was a coalition of industrial firms that were warranting the workmanship or warranting the rules that were supposed to be followed, uh, that can work just as well. It can be undermined just as easily by corruption, whether it's handled at the government level or the industrial level.
But the end
You're
result
right.
was
This is a
deregulation.
problem of
So,
corruption.
but hold on, the end result of that corruption was deregulation, right? So the corruption led to the preferred policy outcome. So forget
No,
for you.
that's
So
not
forget
correct.
how it got there. Do you support the deregulation of the building codes?
I support the idea that industry can put into effect a regulatory structure as effectively as the government. Would you agree that the government, having done it, did not protect the people in Turkey?
Well, the only reason why it didn't protect them is because it wasn't enforced. If they enforced the building codes, then we would have been better off, no?
Were it not for a corrupt system, those people might have been more safe. I think
I
that we can
Because the building
certainly.
codes are good. That's the point, right?
Uh, I appreciate why you want to use the word code, but
Call it whatever you want. Authoritarian building codes. I'd still support it. You can call it whatever
let's
you
stick
want.
to
At the end of
let's
the day,
stick to
more people will be alive with
regulation.
the building codes.
Let's stick to regulation. Do industries have an interest in coming together and forming some regulatory body of work that they agree to live by and have some outside uh, uh, inspection by an insurance company, for example, in order to warrant that the work has been done to regulation, to standard, in
Oftentimes,
order
no.
for people to believe that it's safe? I think that's a good structure. I don't see any argument why that has to be done at the governmental level. Corruption is corruption.
Well, because the industry has one goal, and that's to make money, and predominantly to make as much money in the short term as possible. Society may have other goals, like the buildings withstanding an earthquake, or people having
Right, which
health
is why we
insurance, or
agree that
effective
some regulatory
healthcare.
infrastructure might
So,
make
hold on a
sense.
second. So, that's why these things, many of them, it makes sense to be done at the governmental level, where you have the input of citizenry on societal goals that may be separate and apart from the profit motive. So, I think we have many examples of industries when, like, left to their own, they cut corners, they don't take safety seriously, they do everything they can to exploit workers or, as we've seen recently, to jack up prices and price gouge using the excuse of inflation. We see the way that banks manipulated
You're
people and
conflating
deceived
a
them into
lot of
getting
different
into.
issues there. Why don't we unpack those?
Well, hold on. Let me just finish. I mean, we've seen the way that banks will manipulate their customers and into taking on loans that they're going to be wildly unaffordable. There's an assumption here too from you that people are going to have perfect information and the expertise to be able to sort through all these issues that makes them vulnerable to being preyed upon by big banks or tech industry or big pharma, et cetera.
Yeah, I don't think I said any of that. I don't know where you got that. With all due respect. No, I didn't say the customers would automatically have perfect information. They'd be able to stand up to big pharma or big banks. I'm not presuming that there aren't large institutions and small institutions that would be perfectly comfortable manipulating their customers. And I'm not suggesting there isn't such a thing as corruption and fraud. All of that is absolutely true. I'm just pointing out that as much as you and I may agree, if you could let me agree with you, that a regulatory framework may be a good idea in certain situations, maybe many situations, that framework doesn't necessarily need to reside with an elected, democratically fostered institutional government. That those
But why do
dots
you
don't
think they'll do
connect.
it on their own? I don't understand that. Why do you think the industry will do it on their own? That seems totally ahistorical.
No, it's actually quite historical. Most standardization in the United States is handled in the private sector.
How is the safety of workers during, the like Dickensian era when industry had more carte blanche? They regulate themselves and make sure there weren't kids in the sweatshops and people losing limbs every day? I mean, there seems like some basic safety metrics that they're going to cut corners on as much as they possibly can. Because again, and you didn't reckon with the core of my argument, which was that the reason you don't want industry boards providing this regulatory framework is because they have one interest, which is profit maximization, and society, as represented by the government, may have other interests and likely does have other interests separate and apart from the profit motive, which is why it's appropriate for the federal government or state government to house that regulatory and enforce that regulatory framework.
Hey y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.